One of the biggest things about the new Saab-Phoenix platform was the chassis. I want you to explain to me not only what was so big and new about it, but also what you did there. When did you work on this car, and what was your role in the project?
I was responsible for driving characteristics and comfort.
So were you involved in deciding how this should be, how many links there should be?
What is
The material? What were your thoughts?
Absolutely, we chose the concept, the front and rear suspension, and the steering for the car.
What did you choose? How did you arrive at this particular solution? How long did that kind of work take?
I don't know, it might have taken a year. The actual concept development, yes, I think so. It probably took more than a year, actually. We did quite a thorough development job on both the front and rear axles, of course. But even the front axle doesn't look that remarkable conceptually. But we said that we should develop regarding the front suspension. The McPherson strut is a well-known engineering concept. We chose it because it offers some significant advantages. It is remarkably light and not overly complex, which makes it robust and reliable. It is also cost-effective and practical for daily use. It is space-efficient because it takes up very little room. These are the core strengths of a well-designed system. McPherson. And then, in terms of characteristics, it also has some strengths, along with some disadvantages. So we said that we would remove and minimize the disadvantages as much as we could. And we did that with the help of advanced calculation methods.
At that time,
Back during that specific period, that was certainly the case. Like, the methodology used is still exceptionally sophisticated and cutting edge in a sense.
was that your part in the project? Yes.
Group manager for pre-development chassis.
Group manager for pre-development.
And then I was also the project manager for the front axle.
Okay, that sounds good.
And there we were a team of people. In the early stage when we developed it theoretically, there was a lot of theoretical work. And that,
This wasn't during the GM era then?
no, I would say that much of that work we did might have been 9 as well. It could have started there. But in 2010, we did a lot of work and we presented the theoretical results at the end of 2010, beginning of 2011.
Was it different working under GM and Victor and Mila Tidlund, if I can put it that way?
Yes, I think you could say that. We had a lot of freedom and we were more independent and self-directed during Mila's time. It
Was back to that the original great SAB. Yes, the old one.
You could say the damn fine SAB. I started, and you started as well, if I remember correctly. And then we worked on the development side at SAB, and there we were very self-directed.
Was that job at SAB technology driven?
It most certainly was.
Looking back, was that good? What should we have done differently? Or were you too, many say SAB was too engineer driven? Not economics, maybe it was a bit too slow, or I don't know.
There is probably quite a bit of truth to that statement, but it also essentially made it much more of an enthusiast's car, a bit more, and I really shouldn't say it this way, but maintaining economic control is incredibly important, yes. That you, unfortunately, I don't really know for sure, but it could also be that the company was stuck somewhere in between being a big corporation. We couldn't afford that kind of advertising. If you look now, there's massive advertising from all sides. If you have million-unit production, then it's manageable because you can spread the cost over many units. But we had 100,000 to 150,000 cars a year to sell, and that's not that much. We did try to grow more, but we probably didn't have the means to do much advertising. I think there was cost control.
Do you think that is true? Yes. What do you have to say about it?
Yes, there was, but I don't know if it was the technology, the engineers who created the costs that were cut. No? Then who was it? Well, it was a lot about sales volume that, yes, I see.
But that probably depends both on marketing and maybe product development and how quickly you come out with new models. There are a lot of things that affect it.
Yes, it does. We can say that we had various measures and techniques to handle that. And that was that we didn't have so many major new changes to the car concept. Instead, we refined them further.
Still at it.
They kept refining and opted for facelifts instead. So each car likely underwent 3 facelifts If you look at the history here, I think you can say that our cars lasted 17 to 18 years from when they started, often with 2 facelifts along the way and further development. So they became very long-lived in that way.
But this was not actually a facelift, not at all. So what was truly so remarkable about this front suspension?
The goal was to make the world's best. So it's a McPherson with the advantages that McPherson has, which are, as you just mentioned, low weight, packaging efficiency, robust, and so on. But what
is better about this generation? The Fidings platform's flame compared to the previous one.
Then I'll say this. Of course, you have to look at what the disadvantages are. And one way to approach that is to find out what loads it is subjected to. What are the driving scenarios that create those loads? And that normally it's said that the force enters at the center of the tire. But if the force comes in a bit from the side here, it will affect the steering effects in the kingpin. We want to make the kingpin as robust as possible to handle disturbance forces, that is, variations in forces.
Torx-D was a Saab specialty, yes?
That's one thing, but Torx-D is actually related to driving forces. But what I just said, now that is vertical forces, there are both vertical forces, driving forces, braking forces, and lateral forces that affect the suspension, and we wanted none of them to generate unwanted steering effects. On the other hand, what you do want to influence, that is, a restoring moment from the lateral forces that you feel in the steering wheel, which creates steering feel and precision, and, of course, by having as little friction in the steering system as possible, among other things. But on the other hand, all unnecessary forces that come in and disturb your driving, I've experienced cars where you drive on uneven roads and suddenly you feel it in the steering wheel. That's not what you want. But if you turn, you do want to feel, yes, now I get a restoring moment that I feel in the steering wheel, so you know where the car is. And those things we theoretically analyze thoroughly. We really did it properly this time.
As opposed to what exactly?
I would say as opposed to what had been done before. Yes, and not just by us. Even our competitors couldn't manage it either. So I claim that we were on our way to making the world's best front suspension. McPherson. We developed something called DOE. This essentially means that you design a comprehensive test program in such a way that you allow for a large number of different inputs, many diverse inputs, and then you carefully look at the various responses from that. That is to say, the final results, also considering many different variables. Normally, when you conduct a test, you tend to keep almost everything constant and only change one specific parameter at a time. That is exactly what happens. From a purely theoretical standpoint, now that we live in an increasingly complex digital landscape, we could actually do this in a much more streamlined and efficient manner by having a diverse array of multiple inputs and multiple responses. So there were various different parameters that we could vary at the input stage, and then we focused our attention primarily on 2 specific responses, namely tow and amber, which are the key changes that we definitely want to minimize as much as possible. Regarding tow, also applies to camber. You don't want unwanted camber movements or tow movements when the car is subjected to greater forces. On the other hand, when you turn the steering wheel, you naturally want the wheels to steer. So there are 2 responses here. Those were the ones we looked at. Then we examined the effect of applying greater forces here and minimizing these responses as much as possible. So what do you do then? Then you look at... Yes, we did. We had quite a few, about 6 to 7 different driving scenarios theoretically, but all of this was done through simulations.
Yes.
That's right. Later, when we had actually built the cars, we got a new test driver here. We hope the results were good.
Can you tell us about the first test drive? Yes.
Wait a moment. We'll get to that later. Regarding this, we use both this. We are looking at the design of experiments, but also something very specific called multi-objective optimization. In that process, you try to carefully optimize the entire system with all these different parameters. You are searching for the best possible solution, the truly optimal solution. And to be more concrete about it, it is like this. Consider this specific arrangement from the ball down here all the way up to the bodywork. The fourth leg is attached at the top there. This is a bit like a bow, you could say. Steering forces come in from the steering gear here, and forces from the road come in here, and that bends and twists this system. So the key is to make this controlled. And then we look at how we can make this controlled. Well, first you need a thick tube. These are shock absorbers. It's a combination of, it has several functions. Partly it's a shock absorber in there, but it's also part of the actual structure. So the tube should be thick within reasonable limits. And then the steering knuckle housing should be robust, both in terms of bending, but also around the steering arm here. So in both of those planes, both like this and like that, it needs to be stiff. And these steering pins are made so that you can see they are built up. They
are guided on
the previous generation of the vehicle, absolutely. And then we also have a significantly greater amount of space between the bolts for the fourth arm. So this whole arrangement is clearly and effectively guided in a lateral direction, says. And then the entire steering gear assembly is mounted right here in a place
which is advantageous. If you push here from the side, the entire fourth arm and the steering moment will bend a little, so it's important to place the steering gear at a point that moves as little as possible under these steering forces, even if the system bends a bit. Yeah, but we could talk about this all day. Yeah, well, there are some things like this that we share in some parts. Yes, the steering knuckle housing is mainly what's new, but all these placements can be optimized to minimize the steering effect from an unwanted force. This was also one of our cars, the first car with electric power steering, wasn't it? Yes, that's right, not only electric power steering, but also with a lower gear ratio, so the car had a higher steering response than the existing 9.3. And thanks to the optimization, there was also clearly better directional stability and less disturbance in the steering wheel, and so on. Do you remember the first time you went out and drove with Mulan? Yes, the first time. There's a test track outside Barcelona that's commonly called Idiada. That's where I did the first optimizations on the car in dry conditions, and then a bit later during the winter season up in Arvidsjaur. So then of course, we had those kinds of cars as well. But above all, we had a number of these mule cars, both convertibles and sedans. Were there that many mules? I think we had about 20 complete ones with powertrain, front and rear suspension in total. And then there were unique powertrain mules that, for example, didn't have rear suspensions. But as for complete cars, I think there were about 20. How did it feel for Soman then? It's always a lot of fun with every new project, and you see that what was developed theoretically and optimized actually works, especially if you've made new conceptual choices, like in this case where we now have an entirely new rear end. What was revolutionary about the rear suspension? The rear suspension was an even bigger change than the previous one, right? Yes, here it was a completely new concept, both for Sobo, and it was actually quite beneficial for the automotive industry as a whole to have a so-called 5-link rear axle. This way you could better control the wheel movements. For example, the rear wheel moves upward and backward. That improves both comfort and road holding. And how do you achieve that? It's a combination of the number of links and the orientation of the links that determines how the wheel moves upward and backward when the suspension compresses. Okay? You could say, Roba, just to comment on why this is advantageous. Imagine you're driving and you go over a bump. If the wheel doesn't just move straight up but moves upward and backward, the ride over the bump becomes smoother. Yes, exactly. That was the clever part. And this system does that throughout the entire suspension travel. So it's a clever solution. For the existing 9.3, you could say the rear axle was the limiting factor for performance. But here we were able to turn that around so that we had a much better rear suspension in the 540 than in the 440 project. What's the cost difference for a slightly more refined one like this? Well, At least there's one more link compared to what we had in the 9.3. That one had a so-called 4-link rear axle, so of course it costs a bit more, but we gained a lot. In terms of performance, both road noise, comfort, and driving characteristics with this axle. Road noise as well? Yes, road noise as well. All the links are attached to an isolated subframe. So that reduces the transmission of road noise, and in addition, a more favorable shock absorber ratio also keeps the force input from the road into the body down. So these three things in themselves: better shock absorber ratio, all links attached to an isolated subframe, and how the wheel movement contributes both to comfort and road noise. So now we're standing here in the old sound lab, and back then our colleagues measured this axle as the rear axle with the lowest road noise transmission they had ever measured on any car. Did they measure different companies as well? Yes, lots of competitors, not just internally, but also competitors. So it worked in practice as well. So this was simply a very modern chassis. Yes, the suspension on this car, would you say it was on par with the best or maybe even the best? No, but it was definitely among the best. Absolutely. Then there was another reason why we wanted this kind of axle. It was the possibility of having rear-wheel drive or four-wheel drive. Four-wheel drive, yes, it wasn't so... It was actually quite easy to achieve before. No, why not? Well, you see, previously we had solid rear axles and they work great as trailing axles, but if they're supposed to be driven, then you definitely need some other things. But this specific one is perfectly adapted for that. It was already prepared for rear-wheel drive. Is it right here or? Yes, exactly right there. There are mounts located there, so you can easily put in a complete drive unit. An electric motor here, yes. That was the idea. Of course, it was an electric motor we had in mind here. Yes, but you have driven with an electric motor. Absolutely. The Milner ran like that with an electric motor in the back. And that was in 2010.
Was there any competitor on the market in 2010 that sold an electric rear axle? I don't remember
that.
No, I don't dare answer.
That there were ones like Toyota, for example, which had hybrids.
Yes, exactly.
So they started with electrification, and that was with hybrids. So electric motors existed, but they were often integrated with the automatic transmission in the front. So it was basically two separate cars all the time.
That was to save fuel.
Everything, absolutely.
This was also to achieve much, much better road handling.
Performance.
Both drivability and also, we shouldn't talk about it now, we should make a whole separate film about this. For travel and chassis with ride gurus here. So it must have been really fun to have someone pushing for this.
In parallel, we were working on an electric rear axle, and we had an electric rear axle with a torque vectoring function, both for propulsion and to enable individual drive on the right and left sides, you could say. This allows you to steer with the driving forces and prevents the car from sliding out. Or improve the driving characteristics, or make the car turn more if you want, right? Kind of like a tank. It steers that way. You drive one track forward and the other backward. It can turn on a dime, right?
This comprehensive and highly advanced platform must surely be the ultimate indispensable tool for professional engineers working across every modern industry today.
When it has been doing this, why did it turn out that way? What was the steering wheel following? It has become, or perhaps how that specific development is currently progressing somewhere else. And then we clearly said, we truly want to achieve, we want high quality cars with excellent driving characteristics. So it is not just about the propulsion system itself, but also this unique train-like handling function. Consequently, we developed something that we call Smart EAVD, I think that is what we call it, which features a significantly bigger motor. For propulsion, a bigger one at that time, we're talking maybe 50 kilowatts. Now it's 200 kilowatts or a bit more, but 50 kilowatts for propulsion and maybe only 3 to 4 kilowatts for the train-like handling. So that was the idea. It was smart, small, and lightweight.
But you were also working with hybrids and plug-in hybrids at that time, right?
Electric cars, at least some. But which ones?
What projects were you working on?
I think about 10 electric cars were built.
I understand the situation.
On a station wagon like this, then?
On this specific model, the very latest generation, and as we can see,
There was also a hybrid project, or an electric car project as well. We had been working with hybrids. Yes, we did. Yes, that's right.
we successfully built this entire structure from the ground up, and it looks amazing.
We did. I think we even bought one like that too. Ideas about, well, it's a bit reminiscent of what Toyota was doing, but we had front-wheel drive cars, and between the engine and the gearbox, there was a flywheel motor maybe. That's the kind of thing we were working on. That went on for many years there.
You experimented quite a lot.
Yes, we actually did. No, but you are certainly allowed to do that. You really are. In the initial pre-development phase of the project, you are absolutely allowed to do so. You can't guarantee that it will always be a success, right? You have to allow for that, otherwise you'll never dare to try. If you always have to guarantee that something will be a success, then you have to push the boundaries a bit, right? So that's what we were doing.
But many of these projects, just like this one, aim to improve emission levels.
Absolutely, that's
How honest they are who come.
To take on a strange project that didn't turn into anything that succeeded for me for a
well, for a while now. I think it's actually more the specialized powertrain team who would really have to answer that specific question. There were quite a few complex things going on over there during that period of time.
variable and standard compression,
Yes, that existed too.
quite a large number of silly things.
There was, maybe we have a colleague behind us here, but we had an idea about a thermos. For Karlstad, you could store the heat energy to help when starting up again. That is, a quick warm-up of the engine, because that's also a problem. You lose a lot at the beginning just to heat everything up. It would also have been beneficial for engine wear. The engine wants to start. It has an operating temperature of around 80 degrees maybe. But if you can reach that quickly, it makes a big difference. Yes, that's why. For others here in the discussion, is there anything
Else we should mention here before we move on to the film about the electric drive shaft?
That depends on how far back in time you want to go.
Yes, that's true. Yes, we've also worked with mechanical four-wheel drive further back in time. When
Was
that then? Yes, that was in the mid-1980s.
when Audi started their Quattro initiative.
We had mechanical four-wheel drive in the late 80s. Yes.
Did you take inspiration from
Audi? No, not really.
We decided to explore entirely different concepts than Audi, most certainly. We were looking for permanent drive, but implemented in a completely unique fashion.
what way was that?
So, what happened then? It depended on the way we chose to configure it. It's a differential, a center diff that was torque sensing, you could say. There were many of these kinds of setups available. Drive systems that had viscous solutions which weren't responsive, so they could be front-wheel drive when you started, and then when the front started spinning, the rear axle would engage. But we wanted something like a four-wheel drive that was permanent in that sense, and there were such solutions manufactured.
A couple of generations we had built. There are new generations of the 900. We also had mechanically controlled torque splitters that we used, which unfortunately never.
How does it feel as an engineer when you develop things and say we should do this? Then it turns out that this is really great, and then suddenly nothing comes of it. Well, you could say that if that's the case, it's really disappointing. It has happened a few times that for economic reasons, they don't want to go through with it. But sometimes you just have to admit that maybe it's not quite enough. It was a bit mature enough to finally put into a production car. That is something you can also realize. I can say this, which isn't really directly related here, but we even worked extensively with a joystick control system. Yes, that's exactly right. And we were extremely early with that technology. Yes, we certainly were. The inspiration actually came from Saab Aviation's engineering. That is what we did back then. It was also a kind of very fun and interesting project, really. Yeah. It actually turned out quite well in the end. Yes, it really was very good in many different ways, but there is a certain downside to it too. I honestly thought we were going to go much deeper into the details. But actually, now that I think about it, we could tell a fascinating story about that. Yes, please go ahead. Well, it was a very advanced joystick-controlled car, and I think it is still being kept at the museum. Have you ever seen it yourself? Yes, I am sure you have seen it there. There was a golden yellow one equipped with 2 joysticks, and that was quite a heavy load to manage. You actually have the option to drive it using just one single joystick or with both joysticks simultaneously, and that is a significant advantage, wouldn't you agree? Furthermore, it featured, let's say, in close dialogue with the aviation side of things, some very advanced and sophisticated software. The interesting thing is there is a distinct advantage to using a traditional steering wheel, primarily because you can turn it all the way around, right? This means you can maintain very precise and granular control right here, but it also offers a different feel entirely. Goes away, right? With the next joystick, the entire range is here. That's why, at low speeds and high speeds, you need different amplification out to the actuators.
Development.
The development focuses on outward expansion and force feedback directed inward. This ensures that you experience a much greater force moment gradient, especially when you are driving at high speeds and making small, precise movements. Consequently, the force feedback provided by the system has to be significantly greater in these situations than when you are simply parking the vehicle. This creates a more responsive and intuitive driving experience overall.
Yes, I understand.
So during parking maneuvers, you want the actuators to turn a lot, and then you don't want a very strong torque amplification when you turn. It should be pretty easy, right? Yes, of course. Whereas when you're driving at high speeds, then you want good...
A lot. Yes, that is exactly right. Many people are working hard right now
on that these days now. But I claim that this car is probably one of the best anyway, even though it was made in the 80s, among cars like that with joysticks. But the downside was when we drove on the test track on the ice. If you drive in a circle for a long time, you notice, even if the torque is not high, you get tired in your arm. You do not get that in the same way with the steering wheel.
But did you also get a sense of driving?
Yes?
Yes, I definitely think so too.
It was a synthetically generated artificial feedback loop, but it was most certainly present and noticeable. That was an incredibly exciting development as well.
Enough talk. Now, here is the film on the electric rear axle. Thanks.